Hi, this is Dr. Sana Hashmi. I'm a fellow at the Taiwan Asia Exchange Foundation. So, last week in my Prince Eye on China column, I analyzed what the Chinese are saying about the Apple's pivot to India. And it has been in the news for a very long time. And we are also seeing the results and outcomes that how Apple is moving more of its iPhone, uh, iPad production to India, and it's causing a stir in China, primarily, of course, on the online platforms. So, in China, what might seem like a practical supply of chain adjustment, specifically after the COVID-19 vulnerabilities, that has now turned into something much bigger across Chinese state media and online platforms. So, how China is framing it as a story of Western betrayal and India's supposed limitations with respect to Make in India push, with respect to the aspirations of India becoming the next manufacturing hub of the world, and China's enduring manufacturing dominance, and how other countries, specifically India, cannot really match up to what China has been able to do. So these are some of the core of the online discussions in China vis-a-vis Apple's pivot, Apple's shift to China. So as I already mentioned, this is not something that is new. Apple has been exploring alternatives to China for a while now. Specifically, that shift has been increased, or the urgency has grown, specifically since the COVID-19. But now with Donald Trump re-entering the political scene and threatening tariff on Apple products made abroad and including in India, the issue has become even more sensitive, and it is now getting a lot more attention on the Chinese um, platforms, social media, or state owned media. So now Chinese media is treating it as a shift driven by politics and not really performance. But the real question isn't just whether Apple can produce in India or can actually shift away from China, it's whether India can replicate what China already offers. And many Chinese commentators and scholars, economists, do not really think that it's even close. So some describe Apple's move as reluctant, and this is something that Apple doesn't want to do, but has to do because of the de-risking and the US-China rivalry. So according to Chinese commentators, this is more about appearances rather than substance. And they also argue that India has got cheap labor, yes, but not much else is there, and most components still come from China. India still is dependent on China for raw material. So the main argument is how India is going to be the manufacturing hub when it is still very much dependent on China. Then they also argue that infrastructure in India remains patchy and labor conditions are tricky. So, from their perspective, India is not ready for prime time yet. And in my opinion, these arguments have been outdated, perceived limitations of India. But of course, there is a broader agenda behind it, primarily to how this fits into a broader pattern. Chinese narrative often dismisses India's rise, and much of the commentary has been very condescending and patronizing with respect to India. So, so what they say that India can assemble, they say, but uh, what it lacks is depth in design and innovation. And China still leads in precision manufacturing and supply chain integration. So, in fact, on Weibo, one user uh, argued that Apple stays in China not because of its cheap labor, but because it is efficient and highly skilled. And India, by comparison, is seen as chaotic, and some of the commentary gets quite offensive, as I've already mentioned, and in fact, laced with casual racism. These are some of the main arguments that have been coming out from China, and across the board, India is painted as Apple's backup plan, not a serious competitor to China. And in fact, a very prominent economist in China, Fan Kang, he claimed that it's all about the US being anxious about China's rise. It's not really about India. And India is just a convenient middle step. But then some economists and some commentators also warned about how this is not going to be beneficial for India, as how Trump is threatening tariff on India vis-a-vis Apple's shift to India, and now Trump is more focused on bringing job back to the US. So yeah, how it is going to pan out, this is also something that the Chinese are also discussing. Uh, and these criticism have very much been there, and then I would definitely call it outdated narrative with respect to India. And as in India's hurdle are there, some of, but India has definitely managed to address some of the issues, and now there are a lot of companies that are coming to India, and this is one of the reasons why Foxconn has been uh, that is Apple's main supplier, has been investing in India and has uh, formed a foundation for further investment for Apple's pivot to India now. But of course, China's has not been very open-minded about this to acknowledge this, and of course there it is going to be a very challenging issue how to de-risk, how to decouple from China. In fact, even today, as in this is something that economists in India abroad have been discussing, over 80% of iPhones are still made in China, and more than 150 of Apple's key suppliers are based in China. And of course, rare earth microchips assembly lines, China still has the edge in scale and complexity. But rather than a full exit, this looks like more China plus strategy and diversifying just enough to weather geopolitical risk, but keep the core in China. I think this is one of the main arguments that Chinese are also saying about India. Uh, and on one Baidu post also pointed out that Foxconn's Changzhou factory makes 150 million iPhones a year. And what has been India's output? They say that it's just 30 million. So that scale difference isn't closing anytime. Um, so what they're saying primarily is yes, Apple is expanding in India, but China remains the heart of its production system. And thanks to the decade of investment, technical know-how, government support, they have been able to do it. But of course, it's just not the Chinese government support; it's also the US support that what made China is today. So what stands out is the tone of Chinese reaction. There is a certain defiance, but also an edge of insecurity. And much of the commentary reflects an outdated view of India, one that underestimates how fast things are changing. And even when they acknowledge India's potential, it is quickly followed by reminders that China still leads. That says a lot. It's not just confidence, it's also caution, it's also apprehension, and also um, a lot of insecurity. And perhaps it reflects a broader instinct to India to limit India's rise, whether in tech, trade, and geopolitics. So it's just not limited to the boundary dispute, it's not just limited to Pakistan. It is also expanding to the economic arena. Of course, we have seen that how China has huge trade imbalance vis-a-vis India, but then now it is also expanding to how India is rising. So perhaps Chinese main concern right now has been to contain India's rise, to paint a narrative that is suited to its advantage and paint India as something that is not ready for such a huge change. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next week.